I probably don't need a microphone, but anyway, I'm Marianne Brownlow. Welcome to Hill Center, and I will say its entire name this evening, Hill Center at the Old Naval Hospital.
Thank you.
It's enormously appropriate that we are welcoming this evening Admiral James Stavridis as our guest. Excuse me, I have to put my glasses on so I can read my notes. As I'm sure all of you know, Admiral Stavridis is a former NATO Supreme Allied Commander with 35 years of active military service. He's now retired, and he is currently the Dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts, and is the author of this new book, Sea Power, the History and Geopolitics of the World's Oceans. It's a lot of accomplishments for one person. And Tom Bowman, our moderator this evening, is NPR National Desk reporter covering the Pentagon. So please welcome both Tom and the Admiral. And
it's great to be here. I never knew about this building until I pulled up tonight. It is absolutely beautiful, absolutely stunning. And it's great to be here with the Admiral. We go way back many years when you were NATO Supreme Commander in particular. And if folks who haven't read this book, it is a terrific read, by the way. It's really well done. And it's more than about sea power. It's more than about strategy. There's some good yarns in there. There's some good history. I liked your description of John Bulkley, the famous, for those who don't know, Bulkley was a naval officer during World War II. He rescued MacArthur from the Philippines. And you knew him in the 80s when you were an officer, and he was a tough old bird. And I interviewed him in the 1990s, and he scared me. So he was quite a guy. But the great thing about this book is when I'm reading it, all I wanted to do was hop on a ship and set out to sea. And just you could almost feel the salt air. Like to pull into Hong Kong or go through Gibraltar. But you did a great job.
Thanks, Tom.
Really nice job. So I'd like to start tonight. Well, before I start, listen, we're going to have questions at the end, but if you have a burning question in the middle of this, just raise your hand, and I'll call on you. When I come to things like this, if someone keeps talking and talking, usually the moderator, I keep saying, God, I just want to ask a question. So please, just dive in if you want to ask a question. Okay? So I want to start with the Pacific. And we could spend a whole night on just the Pacific alone.
Sure.
You say the odds are better than even, that the region will develop peacefully. It's a lot more optimistic than people I talk with at the Pentagon. Tell us why you're optimistic about that it can develop peacefully.
Sure. First of all, again, to everybody, thank you for coming out on this balmy summer's night, and thank you to Tom for agreeing to moderate, and to the team, Marianne, Jawad, who helped put all this together for us. The first thing to know about the Pacific is that it's vast. It's 170 million square kilometers. You can take all the land, all the land on the Earth, and squeeze it together, and you would fit it inside the Pacific Ocean. That's because 70% of this planet is water, by the way. And so, point one, Tom, is this enormous ocean space that's out there. Point two is, we tend to think of the Pacific as this body of water that the Europeans and then the Americans somehow sort of found and sailed through. Around the time Christopher Columbus was discovering America, I put that in parentheses, in 1492, he came here in the, we all know this, right? The Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria, right? And what you ought to know about the Santa Maria, the flagship, is it was only 60 feet long. It was a tiny ship. So at that same period of time, the Chinese were sailing ships of exploration that were 450 feet long, 6 decks, 500 sailors on those ships. So these are well-traveled ancient waters. So let's jump forward to the geopolitics of today. The challenge is the rise of China, which is a relatively natural phenomenon we have seen throughout human history, rising powers challenging existing powers. So often those challenges occur at sea. In the South China Sea, Tom, we see this potential of China to try and claim the entire area, and the United States is going to push back on that geopolitically. So this is a long way of saying that China has deep vested interests that they strongly feel. We, on the other hand, work to build a network of allies in the region. We strongly view ourselves as a Pacific power, and those two ideas are on not so much a collision course, but they're going to bang into each other over the course of this century. So the reason I think we're not going to have an explosive conflict is threefold. One is China plays a long game here, and they recognize that the last thing in the world they need to sustain growth in China is a war with the United States. Number two, we have a number of congruent interests, including, for example, finding some kind of practical solution to the problems of North Korea. So I think there are a number of ways we can work with China. And number three, because we have done a reasonably good job of constructing a system of alliances, partnerships, and friendships there, and that, I think, deters China. The degree to which I worry about us getting into conflict is the degree to which we back out of the region and allow China more running room, more ability to claim South China Sea, more ability to break apart our alliance systems. That's where China could miscalculate and we could end up in conflict.
Should the U.S. do more freedom of navigation cruises through that area just to say that we're here, we're not going anywhere?
We absolutely should. So I'm not only the dean at the Fletcher School, which is a graduate school of international relations with a focus on international law and diplomacy. I see many of our graduates here, by the way, thank you. And what I studied when I was there, my PhD is in the law of the sea and maritime claims. So I think I speak with a reasonable level of knowledge about this, but I'm backed up by the International Court, which has just ruled against China's claims. If we stop...
But China ignored it, though.
They did, and so what the fallback is, if you don't have codified international law then, Tom, or treaty law, it then becomes the practice of nations. Therefore, if we stop doing those freedom of navigation controls, we are effectively saying yes to their claims, because we are observing the territorial sea, contiguous zone, and exclusive economic zone that they claim around these artificial islands that they built. If we start to do that, they have a much stronger claim in international law. That's why we need to continue.
Has the U.S. pulled back, though, on those freedom of navigation?
We slowed down, which is fair enough. When the new administration came in, they have sort of reset the buffers. And
well, Harry Harris is always running in the
our very good friend, mutual friend, is Admiral Harry Harris, the commander of U.S. Pacific Command.
Who, by the way, the Obama administration was worried about this guy. They thought he was too aggressive, too leaning forward. I'm not sure
He is.
they're going to let the leash go.
Yeah, he is. And an interesting backstory is Harry is Japanese-American, and therefore the Chinese look at him with extreme suspicion as a result of this, as you can imagine. He also coined a terrific phrase about these artificial islands. He called it the Great Wall of Sand, because they're building them out of sand. So he is now, he is now leaning forward again. We concluded our first freedom of navigation control under the new administration 3 weeks ago. I suspect those will continue.
Now, you know, there's another book that just came out by Graham Allison,
I can talk to
right
you.
down the road. It's called called the Thucydides trap. Everybody know what that means here, Thucydides trap? Do you want to explain it?
Sure. So Thucydides, ancient Greek historian, his classic work is called the Peloponnesian War. It's about the war between Athens and Sparta 2,500 years ago. The Thucydides trap, which has been repeated in history, is what happens when an established power is challenged by a rising power. So Professor Allison did a study of the 16 times in history when that has happened.
Over 500 years.
Over 2,000 years.
Okay.
Yeah, it's over a very long period of time. And in 12 of those 16 cases, war has resulted. So for us not to have a war with the rise of China means we have to beat the Thucydides trap. And as per the first part of our conversation, I think we can, but only if we apply all of the tools of diplomacy, economics, political and diplomatic engagement, and avoid needless confrontation with China at sea.
And as far as working with allies in the region, of course, Singapore has been over.
Yep.
Philippines is sort of somewhere in the middle, I guess.
I can kind of walk around real quick. Our strongest ally, Japan, South Korea, very capable. Here I speak about maritime capabilities and proclivity to work with us. Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, all treaty allies, strong navies, very willing to work with us. Kind of the next tier, I would place the Philippines, which is a treaty ally, but has very limited maritime capability, and a president who is sort of in and out at the moment, President Duterte.
Mm-hmm.
Singapore, not a treaty ally, but highly capable at sea, a very close partner.
And they want more.
They want much more with us. I am a huge supporter of the City of Lions, as it's called. And then you get a mix after that, Vietnam, Thailand, a treaty ally, not much naval capability, Malaysia, Indonesia, friends. The big one to watch in this century in this regard is going to be India. And India's desire / ability to partner, for example, with Japan and the United States. As you know, Tom, we do maritime exercises together with India, Japan, the United States, the so-called Malabar exercises. That's big casino for
And I want to get to India in a second, but you mentioned Vietnam. Should the U.S. have closer relations with Vietnam? Should the U.S. fleet return to Cam Ranh Bay, for example? How close can the U.S. get to Vietnam without China getting extremely upset about it?
I think the United States should move with real speed to develop a very strong military-to-military, economic, and diplomatic partnership with Vietnam.
Are they doing it?
We are in the process of doing so, and the Vietnamese desire it as well because they continue to be pushed by China in their littoral waters. Vietnam, I believe, will be a very strong partner for us, and Cam Ranh Bay, after the Vietnam War, became a Russian base for a while. But I think we'll see American destroyers in and out of it.
And it's funny you mentioned that there was a meeting today, apparently, or yesterday, between Vietnam and China, and it broke down, I think, over border issues. So, and it's funny you mentioned India. I was talking to a senior officer in the Pentagon on the Joint Staff, and we were just kind of talking around the world and all. And he said, you know, we've got to get closer to India. And I said, I'm reading this book now called Sea Power, and Admiral Stavridis gets into that too. And I said, why isn't the U.S., why don't they have closer relations with India?
Yeah.
And he thought it was because it's kind of the scene between CENTCOM and Pacific Command, and it's just almost an afterthought.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It makes sense that he would think that, but I'll give you a different side picture, which I think is more accurate about it.
He was a naval officer, by the way.
Yeah, no.
Wasn't Army.
I got it, thank God. So, first of all, let's do geopolitics 101 in the 21st century. Really big picture, United States, strongest ally, Europe, European Union, Japan. These are all democracies who share a value system. Australia, New Zealand, the other nations I mentioned over here. China. Totalitarian state, non-democratic, but obviously a rising economic power. India. 21st century geopolitics, the big question, where does India go? How does India play in all this? We tend to not think enough about India. When historians look back on this century in 500 years, it will not be about the rise of China. It will be about the rise of India. Why? Demographics. Demographics are destiny. They're a young nation. They'll overtake China shortly. In the end, demographics are what drive productivity. India also is a democracy. They can lift the safety valve and reform a government. That India has many, many problems and challenges, from sanitation to education to tension between Muslim and Hindi, many challenges, but I would bet on India over the long term. So to conclude, the question is why haven't we gotten close? We have tried. President Bush II went to India, gave a terrific speech. I bring greetings from the world's oldest democracy to the world's largest democracy. In the Indian election, 860 million people voted. We've got a population of 320, 200 million eligible voters. We managed to turn out barely 100 million. India had 860 million voters. It is a vibrant democracy. So the United States has reached out and tried. India, for decades, has led the non-aligned movement, has been quite comfortable with this geopolitical position. I would argue that as time goes by, it's a value set that will drive it in this direction. They will be, potentially by the end of the century, our most valued partner.
Is there anyone in government or on the Hill that's kind of pushing this issue and saying we've got to get closer to India, or is it just
One would hope
there's so much else going on that they
One
just,
would hope Ambassador Nikki Haley, who's Indian American, would sort of get this. And from
should be
the
the first
point of the United Nations.
well, okay.
This is another challenge, is we don't have a strong Indian American lobby that really moves us. I'm Greek American. You ought to see the way the Greek American lobby. You know, Greece is a puny nation of 9 million people. If something is impacting Greece, believe me, the world spins on a dime because of the Greek American lobby.
Right.
India has never developed that. Even though India is a rapidly rising demographic here in the United States. Again, time. Over time and demographics, you will see, I think, a natural confluence between those two nations.
Now, any questions before we move on to other countries? Anybody?
Okay, cool.
Tell me who you are and your background.
John Wilson, Army officer working at the Pentagon right now.
Nice.
I know that from some of the internal Chinese writings, they've viewed our major conflicts of the 20th century as impeding on their sphere of influence, kind of the way they look at some of our actions in World War II, as well as Korea and Vietnam. So as you talk about the allies that we're going to strengthen in the Pacific theater, how do we avoid making China feel that we're encroaching on their sphere of influence? The same way the Russians feel in a lot of the expansion of NATO.
I was just going to make that point. Yeah,
Yes, sir. So how do we avoid that?
Well, I think for starters, we look at the way things have turned out with Russia, John. And we did not sufficiently take into account Russian sensibilities at the end of the Cold War. We ought to bear that in mind. So that's point one. We ought to look and let history inform us. Point two is we ought to try and use trade, and this is why I was extremely disappointed when this administration pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We could have stayed in that and brought China into that. We'll need to kind of reset the buffer on it, but I think using economic levers that play to China's interest in growth are number two. And number three is good old-fashioned, keep the communication channels open, exchange interlocutors. And I'll give you a practical example from the nautical world. Every year, the biggest exercise on Earth is called RIMPAC. It's a Pacific exercise done largely at sea. We have invited for the last few years China to participate in that. The more we do that, the more we have those kind of confidence-building measures, the more likely we are to avoid the way things have turned out with Russia in Europe.
Staying on China for a second, I spoke with David Finkelstein some time back. He's a RAND scholar on China. He likens this time to Theodore Roosevelt and the Great White Fleet, and a young America sort of flexing its muscles, sending the Great White Fleet around the world, that China is sort of at that point. Now, do you agree with that?
I think that, like all historical analogies, it's not precise. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. I can hear the rhyme there.
Right.
I'm always a little leery of trying that kind of cross-cultural, but I'll tell you what is very germane is a rising sense of nationalism in China. And it is, as we used to say in the Soviet Union, no coincidence, comrade, that this nationalism rises as China's growth rate slows down. Because President Xi has to create a sense of nationalism if he can't provide the economic power that comes from 10–15% growth. And here's a news flash: with the size of that economy and the demographics, see paragraph 1, demographics are destiny for nations. He's going to have challenges. So I think there's a possibility to see more jingoistic activity out of China. And it will, to close, it will manifest in the South China Sea.
Right back here.
Hi, I'm David Gibbs. I know you can't read Chinese leadership's mind, but I've wondered about this for a while. Do you think that Chinese leadership really thinks that there's historical claims to what's called the 9-dash line, or are they using that as some sort of like posturing or bargaining, or is it like a real legitimate belief on their part that they are entitled to it?
Yeah, they totally believe it. And they base the argument, we talked a moment ago about what are the bases for international laws. One element is historical activity, claims in the region. This is why the Libyans claimed the Gulf of Sidra. And they said, for centuries we've been plying these waters, and they're internal waters of Libya. I don't think that claim held water, and I don't think the Chinese claim held water, but I assure you they believe it deeply.
Thank you.
Gene Rosenthal. I just have a question about your comments on India. And we've been there simply twice as tourists. We didn't visit industrial sites. It's been years since we've been to China. But their industrial might, you can't get away from it. It's everywhere. And we saw none of it in India. So do you mind giving us a little more information as to why you see India becoming so important?
Sure, because if you went as a tourist to China in 1970, what would you have seen? And nothing. You would have had the same reaction you're having right now. And I would have said to you in 1970, but China's really on the move. Why? Because of demographics, because of their history, their culture, and that's how the stories turned out over the 30 to 40-year picture. Exactly the same, my view, for India. I'm not talking about the next 5 years. I'm certainly not talking about what you're seeing today. What I am talking about is how this story will unspool over the next 20 to 30 years. And by the way, I assure you there are many places in India where you can see extremely active industrial activity. Again, India in almost every dimension really is a nation on the move. Think of it this way. China appears to be on a very smooth road right now, but China's future is bumpy because of demographics, because of overconstruction, because of currency manipulation, because of a lack of democracy, because of environmental degradation. India right now looks like it's on a really bumpy road, right? But India's path, longer term, will smooth out, and I think accelerate in the second half of this century.
Any other question? Then we'll move on. I want to talk about North Korea. If anybody has a question on North Korea, just jump in.
About India, Mike Dan Grady. I've had a long interest in India, and the clear obstacles to improving U.S.-Indian relations is our long-standing alliance with Pakistan.
Yeah, Garrett.
And until that changes,
Yeah.
it's going to change between us and India.
Yeah, and I think it is changing, Dan. I think our buy-in in Pakistan is much reduced over where it was 30 years ago, and is actually in a state of increasing tension today, tactically exacerbated by the raid which killed Osama bin not entirely justifiable. But the U.S.-Pakistan relationship ain't what it used to be, and I think that does create openings with India. Your point is very well taken.
And it actually could get worse with this new strategy for Afghanistan. From what I understand, the question now is how hard should they go after Pakistan? Should they withhold money? Should they go after their Haqqani network in Pakistan? What exactly is going to happen? We'll find that out in the middle of July. I can't believe it's been 40 minutes we haven't brought up North Korea. So let's dive into North Korea. You talk about continued military exercises, use cyber attacks against their weapons system. I was optimistic that that's going to turn out well. Is there a military option that is sane, rational, and can deal with this problem, or is it just World War III?
I think I'll give you the percentages, and I don't think anybody obviously knows how it comes out. I think there's a 60% chance we just kind of stumble along, and at some point the Chinese get relatively serious about telling Kim Jong-un, either you freeze your program or we're really going to freeze your economy. And I think we're nudging into that territory, and I'll call that a 60% outcome where they still have nuclear weapons, but they freeze in place. I think there's, on the really optimistic side, I think there's a 20% chance that there is an internal coup, Kim Jong-un is relieved, the Chinese take him out. Number of ways I can think they could do that, and the Chinese then install someone who's more pliable, and I think that could lead to a real, over time, a pretty good outcome on the peninsula, recognizing, and this is what you have to realize, China does not want a unified Korea, and that's their primary desire here. So I think the idea of an attractive outcome for them might be that 20% Kim Jong-un kind of goes away or becomes pliable, and there's a kind of a rapprochement, but it doesn't lead to unification of the peninsula. I think there's on the dark side of the equation, I think there's a 20% chance that the wheels really come off and we're in a military conflict.
Only 20%?
Only 20.
That actually sounds pretty good.
Yeah. But if it does, if we do go there, I think it's going to be bloody, obviously, particularly in and around Seoul, where we have 28,000 U.S. troops, all of their families, probably in round numbers, 200,000 American citizens, in addition to a huge millions in the population there, all within artillery range of the teams, as you know well. Would the United States and South Korea prevail? Yes. Would Kim Jong-un actually use a nuclear weapon? Maybe. So I think that's a very dark outcome. I think it's a 20% chance, but I don't think it's much less than a 20% chance, unfortunately.
And I keep asking people at the Pentagon, they clearly want to work through China rather than, they believe China will be, despite what President Trump said, it's not going anywhere. They're at least hopeful that China will continue to put pressure on North Korea. So I asked people at the Pentagon, I said, what would happen that make you really worried? And clearly it's the launch of an ICBM that would head eastward toward the California coast. And they believe now that they have enough interceptors to actually take that out.
Yeah.
A 90+% chance of taking that out.
Well, now,
if that does happen, let's say, and I asked this senior person the same thing, what would happen if you did see a launch like that an interceptor from, I guess Alaska would take it out? What would happen at that point, do you think?
well, I think that scenario is actually implausible, but I'll tell you what I think would happen if it does occur. I think we'd shoot it down. We're capable of doing that. And I think we would launch a significant retaliatory strike. We would probably attempt to decapitate and take out the young leader, who would probably be in a deep and battle-hardened tunnel somewhere. We'd use every means at our disposal at that point to try and get to closure quickly. Here's why I don't think that's going to happen. Because it's attributable. Because we would know where it comes from. I think if Kim Jong-un wants to send a nuclear weapon to the United States, he's going to put it in a container, put it on a container ship, just like the one that crashed into the Fitzgerald a couple of nights ago, and he's going to send it into Long Beach Harbor, and the first thing we're going to see is a mushroom cloud going up over a large U.S. port. So all the more reason that we have got to solve this politically, diplomatically. In the end, all roads to Pyongyang lead through Beijing.
Right. You mentioned the Fitzgerald. Let's talk about that briefly. I'm sure a lot of people have questions, as I did over the weekend. How could this possibly have happened? What's your sense of it?
Well, let me tell you what it's like to be on the bridge of a ship in a highly congested sea lane at night. How many Navy veterans are here? I see one right here, a couple others. So you're going to know what I'm talking about. The way I'm going to ask you, if you're not a Navy veteran, is picture yourself on 395 on an unbelievably busy day. At night, traffic is blasting along. All you really see are headlights and taillights coming at you, coming up behind you, overtaking you, someone slowing down, you got to go around them. The good news on 395 is that you've got traffic lanes, you know who's going to be on the right, who's going to be on the left, you have bumper guards on the side, there's paint on the ground to tell you where to go. At sea, here's a news flash, there's no, in that area, no traffic separation scheme. There's no way to demark it. So these ships are moving along at relatively high speed for a ship. And all you see on the horizon are lights, some are close, some are far. Now you're using your radar to correlate that picture, and that's what's supposed to help you avoid collisions. You correlate the visual with the radar. That's a pretty good system until on one bridge or the other, or both, someone makes an erratic maneuver that doesn't correlate with the fact that they're going in this direction and all of a sudden they're making a sharp turn and you're watching those lights, trying to figure it out. They're probably too close to you for you to really sort it out with the radar, and all of a sudden you have a dire collision. Doesn't happen often. The reason is because of these electronic systems give you warning off in the distance, but occasionally, I'll give you a scenario, I don't know if this is what happened, but let's say the Navy ship was going this way, the merchant ship was going this way. Let's just say the merchant ship decided to go past the Navy ship, and then, for whatever reason, decided to alter course to port and just misjudged it and crashed into the side. Or, let's say the Navy ship just got disoriented, this ship is passing, all you're going to see in close is a little tail light, and this Navy ship might have sped up, might have hit it. So we'll have to wait for the investigation.
I guess we do know that the crystal hit the Navy ship.
We do know that.
Right.
Right.
But should those...
But think about it, Tom.
Right.
It could be because the crystal was on steady course and speed and the Navy ship turned, bang. Or it could be crystal turned, bang.
Right.
We just don't know
We
yet.
do know that the crystal did a 180 for
We
whatever
do, and that's, if I'm investigating it, my
And
first
how
question.
unusual would that be? That's
Extremely odd.
right. And the other thing is, should the Navy ship have been that close to the crystal to allow that to happen? I remember the quote in your book
Yeah.
of Admiral King.
Yes, the mark of a good ship handler is never getting in a situation that requires good ship handling. What that means is keep your distance, use your tugs, use your radar, don't close the other ships. But in a congested, crowded shipping lane like that, hundreds of ships go back and forth in this area, it's relatively crowded. So you can get in situations where you do need good ship handling. And at the end of the day, we're going to find that there wasn't very good ship handling, I think, on either bridge. Here's something else. We are also going to find that that merchant ship had either 0 or 1 person on the bridge.
Right. And there's some talk the lights were out, maybe. Yeah. We talked about Admiral King. He said at the press, "Don't tell him anything, and when it's over, tell him we won."
Old-time World War II.
That's right. Any questions before we move on, sir?
Same topic, I was just wondering about the crystal, the merchant ship being so much higher speed that its radar might not have had full contact of the destroyer.
But you would have people on the bridge, too.
Yeah, no, the Navy ship, it's a theory. I can see you could also, they could get inside your radar. There's a number of ways. I think the investigators will look at the electronics, look at the capabilities of those very closely. More likely, the Navy ship, which is fully manned, had at least 8 people on the bridge, including lookouts on both sides, should have had a good visual and been able to avoid it. I think that's why you're going to see the captain relieve for cause in the next few days. Somebody,
If you don't mind, let's just use the microphone because we're actually taping this thing.
Sure. Annie Linsky with the Boston Globe.
Oh,
Former colleague in the Baltimore Sun.
Yeah.
what are you doing down? Oh, you're a Boston Globe reporter in Washington.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
I'm part of our Washington Bureau. I was curious, we were talking about North Korea in particular. Donald Trump just tweeted about China and their efforts to help free an American hostage there. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how Trump's tweets, particularly in that case, but in general, are added complexity and when you're looking at some of these sort of delicate diplomatic situations.
Yeah, we are in obviously uncharted territory with President Trump in a number of dimensions. Certainly one of them is his propensity to tweet. I do think we should not reflexively say, never tweet. You know, it's a really bad idea. I can see times in diplomacy where an occasional tweet from the head of state can galvanize a negotiation, can break a gridlock, can solidify a position, actually in a positive way. I was on a panel like this with Madeleine Albright, the former Secretary of State, for whom I have unbounded respect. Madeleine got asked that question, and she kind of gave the, if you will, the stock answer, which is always terrible, let the pros and foggy bottom handle it, worst thing in the world, a president who has a Twitter account. I take a slightly different tack, which is, think of it like your diet. So think of it, a tweet like a shot of espresso. Occasionally, a shot of espresso can be a good thing. It can fire something up. It can get your neurons going. A really bad thing would be 30 or 40 espressos a day. That's where President Trump is making a mistake. He's on it too much. He's not getting advice. He's not using it judiciously. So I can see occasionally throwing in a tweet, maybe 2-3 times a week to kind of move an issue. But I think the constant diet, unsupervised use is not serving us well diplomatically.
And anybody tweeting at 3 in the morning, you can't do it.
Right, no, this is like Trump diet.
All of us, right, right.
Although he doesn't drink, I hasten to say. Did you have one quick
Well,
follow-up?
I was just going to say, particularly in the diplomatic sphere, I mean, you see him tweeting a lot about domestic policy, which, you can read in a number of different ways. But when you see him talking about specifically China, in his most recent one, I'm just wondering if you have any sense for how the rest of the world and how people in your position in other countries are explaining that to their leaders.
Yeah. I think the same way I just explained it, which is this is a new phenomenon. It's an American president using a technology in a totally different way. Maybe I'm sympathetic to this because when I was the NATO commander, I did tweet, even though the department hated it. And I will be unremembered in military history for anything except one thing. And that's that I was the first commander to tweet the end of a combat operation. I tweeted the end of combat ops in Libya, put it out there on a tweet, and I was like smoked by my chain of command for doing that. But I stand by it. I think it was a quick way to do it. It made a point. It moved the message and it moved the needle in a good way. So I think we're going to have to adjust to this. 100 years ago, someone would have said, well, what do you think about the White House is using this thing called a telegraph machine? You know, shouldn't they really write those things out and really think about them? Why let them get on that telegraph and just send a message? Well, you have to adapt. Again, I think, as I said, there's a little over-adaption in the White House perhaps right now, but I think a judicious use, you can start to make that case.
Okay.
Can we get back to C?
Yeah. Hang on one second. I wanted to get to Russia if we could in the 10 minutes we have left. Talk about Russia. The sense is that Russia is a third world country with nukes. They have huge problems with their economy, demographics, alcohol, drug abuse, not to mention their form of government and so forth. But you are seeing a lot of Russian naval presence now in the Mediterranean. You're seeing it in the Arctic and so forth. Their troops, I know, are in Afghanistan now, quietly advising the Taliban and also other mischief we hear from Afghan commandos. Talk about the way ahead with Russia, and of course buzzing some of the NATO planes.
Yeah. Let's kind of do it in a nautical context. So let's talk about the Soviet fleet, which was the equivalent of the massive U.S. Cold War fleet. This is in the 1970s and 80s. And as we get into the 90s, the Russians, obviously the wall falls, Soviet Union breaks apart, and the Russians mothball that fleet. They sort of break up a lot of those ships, and they really don't challenge the U.S. fleet. Now, come forward to this great question John asked a minute ago about Russia, post-Cold War. We sort of put them in a box, their view, with some legitimacy. That resentment smolders in the heart of Vladimir Putin, who is a unitary decision maker in Russia. He has very aggressively moved to rebuild the Russian fleet. So yes, they are, as John McCain famously said, a gas station with nuclear weapons, but they are making money out of that gas station, less than they used to, but they are targeting many of those defense resources into their fleet. They're going to add 100 ships over the next 3 years to the Russian fleet. To give you a sense of perspective, we're going to add 40 ships to the U.S. fleet. We're under strength right now. So are we ahead of the Russians at sea? Absolutely, but they are catching fast. So my
Is
perspective...
it numbers or technology?
Both.
Okay.
Both. Their technology, in particular undersea technology, is almost a match to ours. Their torpedo systems are better than ours. Their hypersonic cruise missiles are better than ours. They can threaten our carriers. They are, in every sense, this is a kind of mini Thucydides trap at sea. They're rising. We're established. We got to watch that space, because Putin's goal is to regain Russian prestige in the world. His number one goal is to appear strong domestically. His international goal is to create buffer space, the so-called near abroad on land. But at sea, he wants that buffer in the Black Sea, the Baltic Sea. That's why our ships and planes are being buzzed in the Eastern Mediterranean, where he's playing kingmaker in Syria, and even in the Pacific off Vladivostok. We're seeing Russian ships recreating the hunt for Red October on both of our coasts. So Russia is a rising maritime power of whom we ought to be concerned.
Put your NATO hat on again.
Sure.
Was it a mistake to expand NATO so much? Victor Davis Hansen out at Stanford said, you know, some of these countries are closer to the Black Sea than they are to the North Atlantic.
Yeah.
And he suggested that NATO kind of pulled back to its original core members.
Yeah.
Does he have a point?
This is sort of that age-old question of what if we'd done it differently, but I'll walk that path with you for a minute. Let's say that we had been incredibly sensitive to Russia's desires, and that we had decided, no, we're not going to let any of those former Warsaw Pact countries come into NATO, but we'll try and have a warm relationship with them. You know, everyone can have their own opinion because this is alternate history, right? But I think what would have happened is Russia would have gradually reestablished itself, would have created a buffer state that, instead of including, you know, relatively minor nations like Belarus and a chunk of Georgia and a chunk of Moldova and a chunk of Ukraine, that's their current buffer. Their buffer today would be Romania, Poland, the Baltic states, perhaps. So I think we would not have been well served by that. I think Putin still would have risen, but we'll never know. Here's the thing about Russia to remember. Russians like strong leaders, and they kind of roll the cosmic dice in that choice. One time they get Ivan the Terrible, but then they get Peter the Great. One time they get Stalin, but then they get Gorbachev. Those dice settled on Putin, and I would argue they were going to settle on Putin because of his ruthlessness and his capability. It's no accident he is leading Russia. He is that strong man. He would have found a way, I think, to dominate that near abroad, much to our detriment.
Okay, we get about 5 minutes left. Sir?
We can actually go beyond 5 minutes.
Okay, great.
It's wonderful to be here with you, Jim. It's
Thank you.
really looking forward to reading this. I'd like to take you back to the Pacific one more time, if you don't mind, and pick up on a couple of threads which you sketched out. One, that the road to Pyongyang goes through Beijing. You mentioned also the potential to reach out to China and cooperate in some naval exercises. If we roll the clock back a little bit, China was an ally in World War II, and in contrast to Russia, China kind of lost during the Cold War, right, because of all their internal chaos. If we were, and this is a big hypothesis, to be able to work together with China to find a solution for North Korea, a more stable leadership up there, which would provide China the buffer, but also get rid of the crazy man, is there any prospect at all that the next 20 to 30 years might be, instead of the trap that you talk about, the emergence of a somewhat cooperative relationship?
Yeah, I think there's, as I hope I conveyed at the beginning, I think there's roughly a slightly better than even chance that we actually end up in a very cooperative relationship with China. And we have a lot we can cooperate on. One thing we haven't talked about that I just want to hit the bell on is the environment and the oceans. And a point people really don't understand is that the oxygen we breathe, 50, 60, 70% of it comes from the oceans. Al Gore used to say, and I have a lot of respect for former Vice President Gore, he said the Amazon were the lungs of the earth. Wrong. The lungs of the earth are the oceans. And it is because photosynthesis in the oceans occurs. And if we damage the ocean sufficiently through global warming, acidification, pollution, etc., we will not be our descendants will not be breathing oxygen. Now, this is not a this century problem, but over time. Point is, China, the United States, this is a kind of a global leadership opportunity. I said earlier the Trump administration should not have walked away from the TPP. An even worse mistake is walking away from the Paris Climate Accords. But this is an example, to your point, that the confluence of interests in the environment, in a stable global economy, in containing North Korea and other irrational actors, I think over time I can see a condominium developing. We're going to have to work hard at it. I think there is a better than even chance.
Okay, here, and then over here.
Severin Coleridge. I'd like to come back to...
Hang on one second for the mic.
Thank you.
Severin Coleridge. I'd like to, as a European, like to come back to NATO for a brief moment. Sure. What is your take on the long-term interest of the United States in NATO? And what do you make of comments from Angela Merkel that perhaps from a European perspective, it's time for Europeans to diversify alliances?
Yeah. I'll give you 5 reasons. I think NATO, and really the reasons are really why Europe matters to the United States, because I think we ought to get it out of the filter of NATO. The reason NATO exists, in my view, is because Europe and its future is a fundamental interest for the United States. One is the economy. The European Union is our largest trading partner. $4 trillion a year pass back and forth between the United States and European Union countries. Second is the geography. Europe occupies incredibly important strategic terrain. When I was the NATO commander, people would say, oh, we ought to get out of NATO, those bases, they're all Cold War. Wrong. From the U.S. perspective, they are the forward operating stations of the 21st century that give us access to the Levant, to the Middle East, to the Near Middle East, to Central Asia. Thirdly, this is really important, it's the values. We talk about the United States, what are our values? Democracy, liberty, freedom of speech, freedom of expression. Where did those come from? You know, we act like we somehow invented them here 230 years ago. They came from the Enlightenment, they came from Europe. We ought, through our founding fathers, but we ought to recognize that value set creates the best pool of partners we're ever going to have. Fourth, the NATO alliance. This is why Europe matters to us, because that alliance exists. We couldn't possibly recreate that anywhere else in the world. And fifth and finally, it's the human capital, the education, the technology. It's a rich, rich pool of partners for us. So there's fundamental strategic interest there. That's why Geopolitics 101, United States, Europe, Japan, I think that's a winning combination. And by the way, I think Angela Merkel is the most principled world leader today. We ought to be listening more to her than anybody else in terms of the future. Now, to her comment that they ought to look out for themselves, I think that's a very natural human reaction to the way President Trump has been at times dismissive of NATO, but I think those fundamental strategic reasons I just gave you over time will ensure that transatlantic bridge survives. It's creaking a little bit right now. It's going to be okay.
Admiral, given your comments about climate change, what's the challenge facing the United States Navy
In what?
in the oceans around the North Pole?
In the Arctic. Yeah, absolutely. So we haven't really talked about the Arctic. It's an incredibly important body of water. To understand the challenges there, look at the geography. It's essentially an enormous lake surrounded on one side by Russia, occupying about half, and the other side, 5 NATO nations, Canada, the United States, Greenland, which is Denmark, Iceland, and Norway. So those two sets face across this lake. There's obvious geopolitical competition there. The ice is melting. It's opening up hydrocarbons. It's opening up shipping lanes. And so we are going to have to, as we do in other bodies of water around the world, we're going to have to patrol it, understand what's there, surveil it, look across that body of water at what is Russia doing, and hopefully find ways to cooperate with Russia. I actually believe the Arctic is a potential zone of cooperation with the Russian Federation. The challenge for the United States Navy, your question, is hardening our ships so they can operate in this environment. We're not very good at that. We have, how many icebreakers does the United States have? Actually, 1. This gentleman held up 3. We have 3 hulls. We have 1 that's actually fully operational, 1 that's broken, and 1 that's really small. Denmark has 5 operational icebreakers. Russia has dozens. China has 14, and last time I looked, they don't have any Arctic front porch. So we've got to operate up there. These are, by the way, Coast Guard icebreakers. I think that's appropriate. Park them in the Coast Guard. And let's build a few, and let's learn to operate not only under the ice, which we are quite expert at with our submarines, but up in these ocean waters because of global warming, they're opening. I think my great friend Kevin Billings has a question.
Hi, Jim. How are you? Good
Hi,
to see
sir.
the crew there. He says hello.
This is a destroyer in Yokosuka, where Kevin's son is currently serving.
And they're in Singapore right now.
They are a sister ship to the Fitzgerald.
Exactly. My Air Force colleagues always remind me that while the world is covered by 70% water, it's covered by 100% air. But can you talk about how air power has changed the sea power and how you see air power influencing sea power going forward?
I can. And the starting point is really December 7th, 1941, when the battleships, which are the pride and joy of the U.S. Navy, the great surface ships, are effectively destroyed at Pearl Harbor. How? By air power operating off Japanese carriers. Fortunately, our carriers escaped. We have the iconic Battle of Midway, a carrier-on-carrier engagement, and then World War II unfolds, and from that point forward, it really is about air power in terms of covering the ocean space, destroying ships on the surface, and really building the ability to conduct the island hopping that ultimately becomes a dagger pointed at the heart of Japan. So from that, if you will, humble beginning on 7 December, I should say that shocking beginning on 7 December 1941, today I can't imagine maritime operations without air power, to include our helicopters, which are shipborne, our aircraft, 80 aircraft on each aircraft carrier, the land-based air, both Air Force and Navy that patrol, do long-range patrol, that do air defense over us, the surveillance aircraft, some are land-based, some come off our ships. Air power is absolutely fundamental. So when I talk about naval power, I'm encompassing the use of air power and, if you will, subsurface power. Maritime operations are three-dimensional chess. Air power, absolutely fundamental to it. The ability of the president to move those aircraft carriers 1,000 miles a day 8 acres of sovereign U.S. territory, 80 aircraft, and marry them up with Air Force assets. That's the future of combat operations.
Yeah, what was that great quote from Admiral Yamamoto in World War II?
He had several.
The one that this war was started by people who didn't understand sea power,
Sea power.
and fought by people who didn't understand air
Air
power.
power, right, great line.
Gentlemen here.
I'd like to expand that question about the Coast Guard and the Northwest Passage. I'm a retired Coast Guard, and I don't know if this is true. Way back when I was serving 20 years ago when I retired, and it was said that the Coast Guard budget was about the size of the Navy recruiting budget. I'm not sure how accurate that was, but then the point is, there's always, to me, in the Coast Guard, and I served both the Navy and the Coast Guard, by the way, it's always been a problem, or I don't know what to call it, but there was always a misunderstood about where the Coast Guard was as far as maritime positioning, safety, and protecting our coast, all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it seemed like, and I don't want to be private Navy or anything like that, but it seemed like our missions were more day-to-day, real, everyday things that we dealt in.
Yeah.
Whereas the Navy was out there preventing war,
Sure.
which is important, of course.
Right, thank you.
But the point is,
But the question,
the point is, what I'm trying to get is that here we are in the Arctic, and we don't seem to have ships, aircraft, or icebreakers that are able to defend themselves. The Russian, my knowledge, the Russian icebreakers are armed, and ours aren't.
okay, so couple of threads in your comment. One is, in times of war, the Coast Guard actually becomes operationally conjoined with the Navy and operates with us. There's a long tradition of very heroic Coast Guard activity in this regard. Number two, of the high endurance, medium endurance cutters, all are very capably armed and ready to join in with Navy battle groups. In fact, when I commanded Enterprise Carrier Strike Group, I had a Coast Guard cutter permanently as part of that strike group, and it was very capable in a combat setting. And this is part of the Coast Guard mission, is that ability to come up and operate. In terms of putting weapons on icebreakers, I think we could put some minimal self-defense weapons on them. I think that would be reasonable. To my knowledge, Russian icebreakers are not offensively armed. They are defensively armed. And I think that might be a concept worth exploring. The bottom line is, on the Arctic, we still have a chance at creating not a zone of conflict and not a zone of severe competition, but really a zone of cooperation. So I would rather, before leaping to arm icebreakers, I would try and arm our diplomats with a sensible approach in that region and try and create a diplomatic rapprochement. I think we got time for one more time.
Yeah, I want to actually raise one last issue, then we go to one more question. Number of ships.
Sure.
Which is always out there.
Yeah.
Jim Webb famously resigned in the Reagan administration because the 600 ship Navy wasn't going to be built. Now you have, what, 265?
275.
275? And they want to go to 350.
Correct.
And there was a story last week, or a couple of weeks ago, that President Trump is not going to put as much money into Navy shipbuilding. So talk about that. Do you need 350? Do you need surface ships?
Yeah.
Can you go more undersea? UAVs and maybe more aircraft as opposed to surface ships. And a lot of my friends in the Army will say, why are they going to build another carrier? Someone's just going to shoot it out of the water anyway. What would you tell them?
Let's do the numbers. So Cold War, the U.S. fleet is about 1,000. Reagan's goal was to get to 600. Didn't quite get there, but had a strong building program to get there. We now have drifted down to about 275 ships. That maybe sounds like a lot. It's not. We need 350, and I'll tell you why. First of all, that's not grizzled old Admiral Stavridis. This is widely shared, as you well know, by every serious analyst. You need about 350, let's call it 360 to make the math work. Let's divide by 3, that's 120. 120 of those 360 are in maintenance all the time because ships require a great deal of maintenance. The second 120 are doing training and exercises to get their readiness up so they forward deploy. That means 360 ships makes 120 that actually go forward and conduct operations. We need to keep carriers, I think most of us would agree, in the Arabian Gulf, in the Western Pacific, in the Northeastern Pacific, and in the Eastern Mediterranean, I would argue, but a swing carrier that can get into the, so that's 4 carriers, that's what you're going to get out of that 120. Again, you have 12 carriers, 4 of them in the yards, 4 of them, etc. So I could walk you through all the ship classes, but that's roughly the right number, and it's validated by hundreds of studies which have been done in excruciating detail. So the real question is, how do we get from 275 to 350, let's call it? Right. President Trump campaigned aggressively on that number. He says he remains committed and that the next budget is going to begin that. I think to actually get there, he's going to have to extend the service life of some of these ships, and instead of retiring them at 30 years, extend them 10 years.
Is that doable?
It is, and I think he also will need to pull a number out of mothballs, maybe the frigates, the Oliver Hazard Perry class frigates, still very capable, and upgun those a bit. I think if you stretch the life of a few, you pull some out of mothballs and modernize, and you accelerate the construction program, you can get to 350 in about 8-9 years.
Oh, okay.
So I think it's a doable ambition. I think you'll see the next budget begin to address that.
Okay.
One more question.
One more question, yeah.
What's your opinion of the littoral combat ships?
I'll repeat the question. What is my opinion of the littoral combat ships? This is a class of ship, quite controversial, that's come out over the last 4 to 5 years. They've had a lot of mechanical problems. They're built in 2 different shipyards to 2 different baselines. I think fundamentally the idea is correct that we need a relatively inexpensive class of ship that can be produced to operate in the littoral waters or coastal waters. I think the execution of it thus far has not been particularly fulfilling. To this gentleman's question about arming the icebreakers, I would want to see better armament on these littoral combat ships first. And they were originally constructed to do 3 different missions. I think we need to narrow that down, make them multi-purpose, capable of operating in the littoral, and not overinvest. We really need high-tech. Catch me afterward for the follow-up.
Okay. Well, thanks very much. I guess that's it.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Tom Bowman. And
Happy to be here.
Thank you very much. And if everybody
Yeah.
I have to assign some books to do some follow-ups, and you look like you're bursting.